Job 42. Then the Lord, geez. All right, off to a good
Off to the wrong start.
Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house, and they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of his first daughter Jemimah, and the name of the second daughter Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapuk. And in the land there was no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of days. Mm. So there's kind of 3 sections in 42. There's Job's confession at the start, and then there's God rebuking Eliphaz and the friends, and then there's Job's restoration at the end. This always so Job has this quite amazing confession, and it always puzzled me because this comes right after God is talking about Leviathan. You know, God is, he speaks for a whole chapter. All of 41 is about Leviathan, and then, which is kind of like the culmination of God's speech, that sort of apocalyptic vision. And then, so for people that I was confused by that for years and years, like, why did it satisfy Job? But one thing that it is clear is that Job is satisfied, and it's that he is it's not that he's been it's not that he's been shamed or rebuked fundamentally. It's that Job has seen something more wonderful than he thought could be. Because he says, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And then he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. So Job when God speaks to him, Job has been rewarded, and he sees it as a reward. He sees things now that he didn't know before. Mm-hmm. He understands things that he didn't before, and so yeah. Do you have any opening thoughts about Job's confession there?
Well, you said he beholds something, right? And I've been thinking about that word behold because it's kind of an existential word in the sense that it has, it's an embodied word because it talks about existence and the ability to grasp something, beholding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is important when you think about why Job is satisfied, because he's holding something. He has a grasp, right? He has an understanding, and it's existential in and of itself, right? It explains in a way that only Job knows why he is. Mm-hmm. Because if you remember, it starts, the whole thing starts out with to be or not to be. That is the question, right?
Right.
And
that's when Job's crying out in chapter 3, right? That's what you're referring to.
Yeah. Where he wishes that he had never been born.
Right.
So essentially, the question is, should I even exist? And now his existence, he holds it with, like, I almost see it as he cradles it like an infant in his arms, beholding, right? It has there's a purpose in it. It seems more purposeful to him than it ever did. And I mean, he says this at a time when nothing has been restored. Right? Nothing has been restored. He's still scraping the sores on his skin and sitting in ashes when he says, I uttered things that I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me. The other part that stands out to me is verse 4, where I'm not sure what your translation reads, but mine says, "Hear, I beseech thee, I beg of you, and I will speak, and I will demand of you, and declare thou unto me." So it feels like now that there's a conversation, right? And that is carried out on into the future. The future relationship between God and Job is one of, I'm going to ask you questions and you tell me the answers, and listen to me, right? Hear me when I speak. And then Job claims to have seen him, to have seen God. But I think that it's a metaphorical kind of seeing. I don't think he actually did see God, but he sees. But at the same time, he does, because it's like
spiritual eyes,
right? Yeah. And then when he says he abhors himself and repents in dust and ashes, it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that he's repenting of his sin, of his previous sins in that. Yeah. But I think that it's very similar to what we talked about the last time, where now that he sees God, it's like Elon Musk walking into that party, right? Where just the presence of God judges, right?
Right.
The thing of the highest value judges everything below. And I always personally keep in mind that repentance is metanoia. It's a change. It's a transformation, right? And there's something about something being born out of dust and ashes there to me. Something new.
Like a phoenix rising from the ashes.
Or a man being created from the dust of the earth.
Right. Right.
Either way, it's a transformation from
Yeah.
something to something greater, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you think of I always think of Paul when he says, when I was a child, I acted like a child, I spoke
Yeah.
like a child, but when I became grow, I put childish ways behind me.
Yeah.
And like when you're a child, being a child is good.
Yeah.
But I see it as like when you grow up, you have to put those things behind you. You have to repent of childish things as you move past them. It's not that being a child is bad. So it's exactly what you said. It's not repenting of sin. It's um being aware of the transformation that's happened to you and then
Well, you could talk
coming
about
that.
that. Yeah, you could talk about that verse when I was a child. You could say when I was a caterpillar, I spoke like a caterpillar, right? But
Yeah.
now that I'm a butterfly, right?
Yeah. I put
I
caterpillar ways behind me.
right. There you
Yeah.
go.
You don't have to have sin in the equation
You don't have to
for
have
that to happen.
wrongdoing in the
Right.
equation, right?
Right.
This is like what I mean when I always say God tells things like they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
God sees things for what they are. Doesn't It doesn't mean anything. If he
Mm-hmm.
calls your heart something full of cankers and worms, like George MacDonald talks about this in one of his sermons. I can't remember which one. And that's where he makes the statement, God sees things as they are, right? And then God talks about wherever he's quoting from, God talks about transformation after that. So it's not that God's saying that it's wrong or it's bad or any of that. He just sees it.
That's just how it is.
That's how it is.
Yep.
And now it's going to be something else.
Right.
And that's what happens to Job. He sees himself for what he is, right? But then, but it's all prefaced with, let's keep this conversation going, right? I'm gonna demand, and I want you to tell me the answers, right? What does your translation say for verse 4?
Verse 4, the English Standard Version says, "Here I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me." That's what God says. That's what God first says to Job in chapter 38. He says, "Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me."
Yeah.
So my version actually has the quotes around it, as if Job is quoting God, saying, like, you said this, and so then Job's response is, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's another way you can translate that, which Lance always talks to me about, which is, listen and I will speak. I will ask you and you instruct me.
Yeah.
And so it's now you teach me, like Job saying that to God, you teach me. So
but it's a two-way street. Listen and I will, and then you help me figure this out.
Yeah, and Job says that earlier. I forget what chapter, but he said if as he's lamenting, he's like, if only I could speak to God and he would listen, or if he would speak and then I would listen. Mm-hmm. Like he's asking for this hearing. And so this is almost a reflection, like this is what's happening now. Like he's finally coming back in contact with God.
Yeah.
So back at the very beginning, he says, I know that you can do all things and then no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Like this is the first thing that Job says. This is the first thing that impacts him, that nothing is beyond God.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this before, but just to go through it again, like the whole middle part of the book between Job and his friends, it's it's framed in terms of justice and in terms of the doctrine of retribution. And even when Job finally gives his sort of last, his last speech, he ends that speech by asking God to indict him, to meet with him and indict him. So to officially charge him of a crime. So make it explicit what was done wrong. And Job even says, I'll wear it like a crown and I'll approach you like a prince. And so Job is still holding on to his integrity, denying that he's done anything wrong, and also sort of knowing that God can provide an answer, but it's all within the framework of sort of this justice. It's all framed within this justice framework. And God's speech.
Oh, sorry.
But let me just.
Yeah.
God's speech is entirely framed in terms of creation, in terms of creative forces,
right?
And how, God's serving everything, giving life through all sorts of circumstances and creatures, and then when God speaks of Leviathan, and it, the Near Eastern mythology was that there's a clash between the chaos monster and the God in order for the world to be created. So even when God is talking about Leviathan, this creature, he's alluding to creation and what it takes to create. But unlike those creation stories, it's like a God and a chaos monster, they clash. Maybe the God succeeds and then the world's created. This story is entirely different because God is like, no, this is my creation. The chaos monster is my creation. And so there's like a meta creation narrative that Job does that's kind of a commentary on all those old myths that sort of have this dualistic view, where God and Job is above all and creates all and serves all, and he's even bragging about his creation, and it blows away Job's justice framework.
Yeah.
And that's what Job is repenting of, and that's the transformational process he undergoes.
Yeah, and that's what he sees when he says, now I've seen.
That's what he sees. And so what are God's purposes? God reveals his purposes. My purposes are life. My purposes are creation. My purposes are to serve all. And in the justice framework, it's easy to make an argument of how this or that is hindering or opposed to the purposes of God. And Job's saying, like, no, he says, no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Even those that try to thwart, they end up playing into your hand. He sees how everything works and how God is running the universe. I don't know how to describe it any better than that. So
no, that's good. That's really good. Yeah. I forget what I was going to say when I interrupted you back there, but I think one of the things that really stands things on their head is that, that because all of this is God's creation, including Leviathan and Behemoth, right? Where is this line of good and evil? Like, it really blurs that line, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah.
It really does. Like, because now to curse Leviathan would be to curse God's creation, right? And God's plans, because that's essentially what Job is calling Leviathan, God's plan, right? Can't be thwarted, or Behemoth, or any of it, right? God himself says, I feed the lions, right? If that's his plan, and you call it evil, then essentially what you're calling, like, in other words, everything is sacramentalized. We talked a little bit about this in the conversation. Like, there's this idea that when Christ's pierced in the side and the blood and the water flows onto the ground, that all of the earth is sacramentalized, right? So all of it becomes a sacrament. And I that is not a surprise to me, because everything speaks of God and his plan, and that is what God's speech is to Job, is creation that speaks of him, right? So anyway, I think that's something that we have to be made aware of, is that there's the line between good and evil. Like, I'm trying to think, there's an example, maybe you know it. Well, I think it's just the examples that God gives, where he says, I'm feeding the lions. What are you going to do with that?
Right.
What are you going to do with that? That's like tossing the ball into your court, and then you're just like, like.
Yeah. When just before when the friends were talking and they said, God's going to crush the lion and break their jaws. And he's like, who do you think helps the lion hunt when their young is hungry? Like, you're just like, oh,
yeah.
Didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings us into the next section with Job's friends, because God rebukes them. So he says, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. I
have a question.
Go ahead.
Before we move on. In verse 3 in the King James, it says, well, I'll read verse 2. I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from you. Or it says purpose. Who is he that hides counsel without knowledge? Is the beginning of verse 3 in my Bible. What is it in yours?
Yeah, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? That's what God says at the very beginning in 38. So he's quoting God there.
He's quoting God. Okay, that's
and then he says, in response to that, so you said, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? And then Job says, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know.
Yeah, so he equates that kind of ignorance, right? There's a certain kind of ignorance that he's describing as obscuring, right? Which is what God talks about before. And I think that's interesting, how ignorance can actually obscure the image of God in the world.
Well, and it's also, there's that for sure, but then there's just the fact of being finite. I don't know everything.
Yeah.
And like, it's just a fact. I'm not going to know everything. And so there's going to be some things that I don't understand and that are too wonderful for me that I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's always going to be those things that are beyond me. And it's even the same. I say that it's even the same for Christ, because he cries out on the cross, my God, why have thou forsaken me? And he cries out in the garden. He says, if there's any way to let this cup pass, let it pass from me, but not my will, your will. So even Christ comes to this point where he comes to the end of what he can see and what he, there's that aspect of it for sure. But then he's always trusting of God in the end. He says, not my will, but your will. And then when he cries out on the cross, my God, why have thou forsaken me? It's the beginning of Psalm 22, which is I think it's like a redemptive psalm. It's a
reflection of that suffering servant, I think, too.
Right.
Yeah.
So even in those statements, he's Christ is still he's speaking from his finitude as a man, but he's also still has that faith in his Father and his love towards his Father.
Yeah, he's still oriented towards God, right?
Yeah.
Like he's not looking for any other solutions. He's asking God for the solution, and is willing to accept whatever might come his way.
So I think that's part of it for sure. That there's just like we just can't know anything, and then yeah, I think yeah,
that's good. I just wondered because I know that was a statement that God made, right? Who is it that obscures, right? Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, so the Lord rebukes the friends and says, okay, so then take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourself.
Well, you have to say the best part. My wrath is kindled against thee.
My wrath is kindled.
And against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job has.
Yeah. And that whole sentence there is
that thing. Like, what is that thing, Jess? Job. I was going to call you Job. You made it.
I'm Job, yeah. But that's Job's integrity that God saw in the beginning. That was his blamelessness and righteousness that he saw from the very beginning that ends up coming out throughout the middle. And this is like the hermeneutic on which to interpret the entire book of Job on. Right. Is that the friends anger God and Job speaks correctly. And if you read the whole middle part of Job with this in mind, it's mind-blowing, because it's not necessarily easy to be, if you just read the middle part without this, it'd be difficult to say what Job says sometimes is right and what the friend says is wrong. And it'd be difficult. And even if you did figure out that Job was right and the friends are wrong, it's still kind of hard. Like, in what way?
Yeah, but it's not a literal right and wrong.
Right.
It has to do with the heart again.
Yeah, it's Job's integrity.
Yeah, it's the intention. Job is seeking reconciliation with God because he can tell that he's, somehow disconnected. At least his situation has given him the feeling that he's disconnected, and whether he is or not is a whole nother discussion, but he feels the disconnect. And so he needs an answer, right? And God is gracious enough to give it to him. Whereas the friends believe that Job is responsible for his disconnect and that he needs to just go through the motions and fix it, right? And so that they can all get back to business, right? As usual. So there's a totally different intention there.
Right. Yeah. And you talked about this before. It's sort of a mechanistic worldview where you do this, God will respond this way.
They're not seeking a deeper relationship with God. They just they just want to make it so that they can continue what they were doing before. Well,
and look, this is interesting how God then responds to them. He says, okay, here's something that you need to do to restore your right standing. He almost gives them this, but he gives them he gives them a sacrifice to,
Ask.
or tells them something to do to restore the relationship. And this is the first time God speaks to the friends.
Right.
And so it's almost like what is it? How you judge is how you will be judged.
Right.
And so he's like, you want a mechanism? I'll give you a mechanism. And who's the linchpin in this? It's Job, and you better recognize that. And so so going through the mechanism, they actually have to look at Job and come to the realization of what Job has done right and what they did wrong. They have to actually seriously contemplate it.
Yeah, like they bring the stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Job is the mediator. He's the one that reconciles them back to God.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, they're just a bunch of guys standing around with stuff in their hands.
Right. Yeah, it's Job's prayer.
Yes.
So he says, my servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly.
Yeah.
So this is, and okay, so he says, you have not spoken about me what is right, like my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Timite, okay, they did what the Lord told him, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. I want to go back and make a connection here because, oops, I went too far back. Okay, so in Job 40, I was mentioning how this one part was kind of
about the proud,
a little bit difficult for me, where so it's 40 verse 10 to 14. So just before he talks about Behemoth. Well, I'll even just start at verse 9. Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity, clothe yourself with glory and splendor, pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the world below. Then I will also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. So this is like, you could easily imagine a angry, violent Old Testament God pouring out his wrath, bringing down the wicked. But I just want to point out this in 42 verses 7 through 9, what we just read is exactly how the Lord does this. How the Lord brings down the wicked, and this is how he adorns himself with majesty and dignity and glory and splendor, and pours out the overflowings of his anger. This is the example.
Beautiful.
And it's Job praying,
mediating it, and accepting the sacrifice of the friends, and reconciling them. Do you think that's what God means in where did you read that now?
40, 10 through 14.
That 14. Then will I also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. That's kind of an interesting little statement, right? Like,
yeah,
you can. It's like when Jesus says to Peter, "Don't be afraid," right?
Mm-hmm.
What did he say there in when he was walking on the water? Your faith, your doubt, or something like. And I thought to myself when I read that for the umpteenth time, it's like it's almost like he's saying, don't doubt yourself. You've got this, right?
Yeah.
There's something about that to this sentence too. Like, what does your translation read?
Well, it says basically the same thing. I will acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a whole right hand, left hand symbolic thing of, going on there. But if you just leave it at, I mean, the right hand is usually what it indicates, the right, the correct, the orthodox, the just, the all merciful, all that is contained in the right hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this can actually, like, you can do this. Job is this. He is that right hand of humanity, right? He's the right hand man, if you want to say it that way.
Well, and as like a Christ figure, like Christ ends up sitting at the right hand of God.
Right.
He's
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, so and you've mentioned it before, but Job mediates this. So I can't remember how much we talked about this or not, but previously, but throughout the middle of the book, so like I think it's in chapter 9, Job says, there is no arbiter between me and God. He's lamenting the fact that there's no arbiter. Then later on, he says, yeah. What if there was a mediator? And then he says, and you can see the idea. It like shows up and then it like vanishes, and then as they speak, and then it shows up again later on, chapters later, where he says, what if there was a mediator and someone that could mediate between me and God? And then later on, he says, I know my Redeemer lives. Now he has this confidence. He's like, it's not even a what if. It's not a lament. He's like, I know it for sure. And Job ends up becoming that, like that thing that sort of dimly sparkles at the very beginning. And all he can say is, there isn't an arbiter. And then later on, he says, I wish there was a mediator. And then like, it's,
you think that's indicative of his becoming that?
I think so.
Like the reason that it just becomes so much, he becomes so, what's the word, sure that this person exists.
Yeah.
Sure within himself that this person actually is out there.
Yep. Yeah. And then because, because that's where his hope is, and that's where like he then becomes that. Mm-hmm. Like he becomes the mediator. And this is, well, then this just gets into the whole idea throughout the whole Bible of man as mediator between heaven and earth. Like that's man's role. And so this isn't just a story about a man becoming the mediator for God and his friends. It's about a man. This is the creation story of man. The book of Job is the creation story of man from the perspective of the man.
Yes, it is.
And so, what Job goes through is he's basically experiencing becoming the mediator within himself. Mm-hmm. So, I can't remember if I gave this example.
And I just want to reiterate.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to forget, even though we just read it for I don't know how many weeks. that Job only made this realization through suffering.
Right.
Like, you can just say, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and move on to the next thing. But no, there's a lot of suffering in Job. That is what Job is known for. Mm-hmm. Right? We say the patience of Job because he suffered. Mm-hmm. And when you are in the midst of suffering, every minute feels like a day. Mm-hmm. Right? Like it's long. Time stands still when you're suffering. So somehow we have to keep in mind that there's a link between the transformation of Job's mediatory role between God and the rest of creation,
Mm-hmm.
and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make that really clear.
or at least the process involves suffering. It
Well,
made it like whatever it is, whether the
there's a
suffering does.
relationship there. There's a relationship there. That's all I want to say is there is a
they're total exactly
between the mediatory role of Job and suffering. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The one doesn't happen without the other. It just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't.
Right.
And it's important. And so for that reason, it's really important. Like, it's astounding to me that people would actually try to prove that Job sinned when
Right.
at the beginning of the book, God says, have you seen my righteous servant Job?
Mm-hmm.
Satan. And at the end of the book, he vindicates Job,
Mm-hmm.
right? By saying,
you have not spoken about me what is right, like my servant Job has.
Yeah. And
he
then
says it twice.
And then he decks him with majesty and excellency, and arrays him with glory and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like you read in chapter 10. Verse 10, chapter 40.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm sorry that's how the story is, but that is how the story is. Sorry. What can I say? No, like, if you really want to think Job was sinful, like God says, where is that here? Oh, it's right above chapter 40, verse 8. And this has been going through my mind for the last few days.
Mm-hmm.
Will you also disannul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you might be right? God says that, right? So we have to be so careful that we don't forget what's actually been said in this story. And what's really been said in this story is that Job was righteous before God, and that God arrayed him and decked him with majesty and excellency and glory and beauty, and let him mediate for the lives of his friends, because God's wrath was kindled against them because they didn't speak rightly of God.
Right.
There was no hope in their speeches. There's no hope. Job was constantly there, always there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was a hope of something good, something more than he could imagine. And for them, they're like, no, that shoot, forget the shoot. The tree gets ripped out by the roots and thrown into the fire.
I know, it's brutal.
Right?
Yeah.
And God calls that not speaking rightly of him.
Right.
So what does that indicate? To me, it indicates that, there is a hope. There is a green shoot coming out of that old tree. That's me.
Right. Yep. I have an example of this. So I have some friends, they young married, they got pregnant with their first child. He got transferred he was temporarily went to India to work for 6 months with his company. And so his wife came with him, and while they were in India, she suffers a miscarriage. Like, just terrible experience. Like, first of all, they're in a foreign country. And then the hospital where they were at, they weren't getting good care. Then they have to get on a flight, try to emergency get on a flight and get back to the States, only for, basically everything to fall apart. And they lose the baby. And, just terrible experience, just full of, suffering and all that. And so in the years that followed, she really wanted to help other people that went through this experience, because it was really difficult for her and him, but she kind of was leading this. So they started a nonprofit organization, and they basically started holding meetings, sort of like group meetings for mothers and couples that had miscarriages, lost babies. And would they have done that without, going through that experience? Like, this is what we do. We suffer something, and it helps us mediate, like helping people get through those same sort of things.
Yeah.
And
this is what do you think? Well, I mean, what comes to my mind here is Heidegger's idea of being towards death. I think we've talked about this before. And that the outworking of that, if you can move yourself towards death, like, so, in other words, okay, so Heidegger talks about thrownness, this feeling of thrownness, right? And that has to do also with, like, not just birth, but your death too, right? You can't choose it. You have no control over it. You don't know how it's going to go. It's going to happen, But if you, and that this is probably also what Peterson talks about when he talks about voluntarily, picking up your load and carrying it up the hill and all that. So if you be towards it, if you move into it, and this is what I describe as walking out into the landscape, look around. Yep. Have a look around. Don't be afraid of it. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't think that maybe one day in the future you'll have to confront it, because if you don't be towards death, then when it happens to you, you will be completely unprepared for it. Right? Even though we are unprepared for it. And it doesn't have to be your death. It can be someone else's, someone close to you, right? But what it does is it brings you into this caring person, right? It gives you empathy.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens to Job when he starts talking about the wicked people. He's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, these people are starving and they're trampling your grapes. They're thirsty and they're starving and they're bringing in your sheep and they're not stealing anything. Wow, that's really dignified. That's amazing, right? Because he knows what it is to suffer.
He knows what it is.
He realizes that they're suffering and they're suffering with dignity. And so is, and here he is whining about it. I wish I was never born,
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so, and then he says, well, wait, they're actually really prospering, the wicked, like he starts to have this empathy for them. Yeah. Because we all suffer, right? So I don't know. There's a unifying force behind it somehow. There's something that makes us all the same, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that happens with Job, because right after the part where he sort of empathizes with the oppressed, and then right after that, he starts talking about how he has suffered the fate of the wicked. So he says, let this happen to the wicked. And he lists all the things that's happened to him. So
that's where he's flipping the definition of wicked.
Well, not only it's
because he's not talking about the wicked that he was talking about before when he wishes that on them. I don't think he's not talking about the same wicked. But maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know, but at least he's identifying with them and suffering their fate. And so from, think of it as a spectrum from being the oppressed to the oppressors and the judgment that they'll face. Job has gone through it all, basically. So you can see that he's experienced, and then plus add to that all the success that he had before. He's experienced everything a man can experience. And so when you're talking about a mediator, if you put someone between you and God that's going to mediate between you, what a better person than someone who can empathize with your exact situation.
Yes, of course.
Whether you're oppressed or you're wicked or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, Job mediates for his friends because
that's really good, Jess.
Because he can empathize with them, mm-hmm. and with the fate that they could end up in.
Yes.
And so because God's anger is kindled against them, and so what do? Like, God is going to listen to the mediator,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And listen to his prayer. So
interesting.
It speaks to the goodness of God too, because this seems to be his getting. This seems to be God's plan all along. Is to get Job
to
set up into the mediator role.
Mm-hmm.
So that the best of all men who can empathize with all.
Yeah.
That's who I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's who I want to mediate between me and the earth.
Right. Because that's who I am.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's who I am.
And that's kind of the point I was trying to make when I was reading in chapter 40, is like, this is how, when God says, tread down the wicked where they stand. This is how he treads down the wicked where they stand, by reconciling with them.
Yeah.
Like this is the mercy and judgment being the same thing.
Exactly.
And
yeah, so, we just can't parse it out, because when we hear the words tread down the wicked, we think it's trampling them underfoot and killing them and disposing of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is the interesting part about life. When something is alive, does it ever die? Like, I know this is like kind of a woo-woo question, but like, how do you can't, unless you change everything, unless you wipe the memory of all of creation clean.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I recently watched this really great podcast, and it was talking about sacred places. And there's this there's a glen in Cornwall called St. Nectan's Glen, and a 4th century monk lived there. And people still go there to this day to leave ribbons, teddy bears, crystals, seashells. They stack stones and they cry out. Okay. And I mean, I'm not going to assume that these are all Christians. These are just human beings. Okay.
Right.
Who go to this sacred place,
mm-hmm.
to cry out to the sacred for help in times of trouble. Right. And what's so fascinating about that is that this is happening right up to this very day.
Mm-hmm.
And what is that? They seek a mediator, right? Yep. They're looking for something to mediate up. They go to. We talked about this too in the conversation with Dominic, but he talked about the Celtic. The Celts had these what they called thin places, where the natural and the supernatural came together, and that that there were places in the woods or in the landscape that you could actually feel the other side. You could feel it, right? And then he talked about how the Maori have something equivalent to that. The Australian indigenous people have something similar to that. They talk about these places, these sacred places, as thin places where the divine and the human can almost touch, right? And I said to Dominic and Nate in the conversation today that there is a deep longing for a marriage, right, from the divine. You know, it's like he stands and beholds his beloved, but he can't touch her, right? And she can't see him, you know? And he needs a representative, and that's Job. And Job, why Job? Because Job is exactly the man that God is.
Yeah.
He cares.
Yeah, and I think Job is able to offer that sacrifice and that prayer because he sees God. Like we read, like you just said, we read those words and like trample down. That sounds like, no, Job saw what those words meant and he's enacting them. Like that's,
well, yeah,
that's
and then Jesus tramples down death by what?
Death.
Yes. Yep. He enters in the most empathetic way. Right? Like there's nothing more empathetic than laying down your life for a friend.
Yep.
What Jesus said.
Yep.
No greater love, right?
Yep.
Yeah. You know, there's a beautiful story in Fantastes. It's a story within a story, and it's called The Story of Cosmos. And I won't tell the whole story, but there's the concept of the story is just so incredibly beautiful. This guy buys this mirror in an antique shop and he brings it home and he hangs it in his living room, and he's sitting in his living room one day and something catches his eye and he looks at the mirror and there's a woman in the mirror, and she enters into his room because that's what's reflected. Okay. And she sits on his couch, but it's in her mirror. And she starts crying. Right. She's crying and she's troubled and she's pacing and she's, you know, he can see that she has something is tormenting her and she can't see him. And he can see her, right? And his heart is breaking for her. And so he tries all these different ways to communicate to her. Nothing works. So then he finally decides, okay, he realizes because she's in his room. Okay, she's in his room because it's the mirror. How sparsely and uncomfortable his room is. How sparsely furnished and uncomfortable it is for this woman who's suffering. Okay, so he goes out and he buys all this beautiful furniture and fluffy cushions and he puts them in his room. And she comes into the room in the evening as usual and is astounded by all the new furniture, right? And is just so happy. And then her life starts to feel better, right? Because he's changing the room for her so that she's more comfortable. And it's through this that and I'm probably going to cry now. It's through this that she realizes that somebody loves her. Somebody out there is watching her. And this is a thin place, eh? Yeah. There's nothing but a little sheet of glass between her and Cosmos. And he can only behold her. But she can't see him.
Yep.
Yeah. So I won't say anything. If anybody wants to read the most incredible story ever, it's in Fantastes. And yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, there's a way we can't see God. We can just sort of we can see what he does.
That's right. And if we pay attention, we see that he loves us, right? That is who he is. And because we can't see him, he needs a mediator. He needs Job to mediate. So he needs a man who is just like him. He couldn't settle for anything less, Jess.
Right.
It wouldn't be the proper representation of what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
You know, Job had every right to turn to his friends and spit fire at them and say, see, I told you. I told you I was right.
Bring the sword down on their heads.
And then, like God asked, will you condemn me just so that you can be right?
Right.
Job condemned his friends just so that he could be right. We all know he's right.
Yep.
And no, Job doesn't do any of that. He prays for them. And he brings them into communion with God through their sacrifice.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, this brings us right into the next section.
Yeah.
Which, so it says the Lord restores the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. So as he's praying for his friends, the Lord restores his fortune. So there's something that happens there in that when he mediates, that everything gets turned around at this point. Like, or maybe it's happened already, but the world around Job finally starts to line up with what has already happened in Job. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Now, I kind of read this
I just want to say,
yeah,
I love what you just said back there. The world lines up with what just happened inside of Job. Okay, that is a true statement, Jess. This is why it matters that we are transformed. This is how we mediate and co-create with God, right? Because the world will line itself up to what happens inside of us, whether it's good or bad. Okay.
Right. Right. It just happens. Like there's no, it's no manipulation. It's no like tricks. It's just what happens. So the Lord gives Job twice as much as he had before. And I think this is actually the verses that follow is actually a description of how the Lord did this. In which way it happened, which it says, then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all that known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord brought upon him. And each one of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. So this is like everyone, all his brothers and sisters and everyone that knew him, they see Job for who he truly is. Yeah. Like it's on display.
They honor him.
They honor him willingly. It's not compelled.
Every knee shall bow and every tongue
confess. Yeah, and they give him
well, because he mediated for them. How many of these brethren and sisters, I know that they're not the friends, but how many of them stood behind the friends? And I mean that metaphorically and physically. Okay. So it was like Job and God on one side and the friends and everybody. Like, because nobody else came to his aid.
No, right? And Job even says, I become like a byword among the people. And they, the ones that are outside the city, they throw curses at me. And
so whatever mediation that Job did for the friends, he did for everybody. This is why I think
that's interesting.
For the whole world. I also think it because Job is, for me, it's Job / humanity, right? Like this is not a a story about a man and his friends. It's a story about humanity and the world, right? And the role of humanity. And anyway, so.
And then came to him all his brothers and sisters. Okay, they ate bread with him in his house. I think there's probably all kinds of symbolism there, but but they bring him the money and the piece of money and the ring of gold, and so I like to think about this is their
pledging an allegiance, or
well, they're raising him back up to where he was, because they're like, if anyone needs to rule, it's Job, because he's a good man, you know.
Well, they put themselves under him, which automatically puts him above them.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you see, so Job has this prophetic vision from God, this apocalyptic vision. So Job is prophet. He mediates the sacrifice of the friends. He's the priest. And then now everyone willingly submits themselves to him and brings him gold. So he's the king. So he's prophet, priest, and king here at the end.
Yeah.
And it's totally everyone willingly participates in this.
Voluntarily.
And I think this is a description of how, you know, God restores him. And then it says the Lord blesses the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And then he has double.
You did say that this book is apocalyptic too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you think about it as a apocalyptic in the sense, not just revelatory, but apocalyptic in the sense of the end of, the end of days, right? There's a lot going on.
if you think about this so you know how Job was framing everything in the terms of justice, in terms of righteousness and wickedness and what is just and unjust, and through Job's own experience, he has this idea of the mediator, and then his vision of God blows open this framework. That was how everyone viewed everything, was in the terms of the righteous and the wicked, the just and the unjust. And all of a sudden Job has this encounter with God that blows that apart. And so we're into a new era, we're into a new age, something beyond the doctrine of retribution, which had kind of,
well, it's like, and now there's suddenly a new heaven and a new earth, Jess.
Yes, that's exactly it. and it's brought about in this vision, and they've got to figure it out. And the first thing they do is they make Job king. He's mediating this, and then Job is blessed. And so we're into a new earth.
Yep.
And
because Jesus says this too, right? Behold, I make all things new. And so it's like no one's ever going to see the relationship between, as long as Job mediates the way that I know he would, the relationship between God and the rest of humanity is never going to be what it used to be.
No,
because now mercy has been shown. You see, mercy. So like beforehand, the wicked suffered and the righteous prospered. Okay. But now the righteous suffered and the righteous were made whole again. Right. So there's restoration happens, reconciliation happens. And I don't think that they ever had, like, this was what Job was getting at when he was saying, well, maybe a little green shoot comes off the old tree root, right? Maybe there's hope for the wicked, because I'm wicked. Look at me, I'm suffering. right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, no, it just gets ripped out by the roots. Like there's no hope,
And burned.
right, for the wicked. But now all of a sudden, Jess, think about it. They're the ones who are wicked. Okay. From God's perspective. That's why Job has to mediate for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're prosperous. Like everything gets flipped on its head, right?
Yeah.
And so this new heaven and new earth is not just what Job experienced, but the whole world is transformed by this. They have to be, because mercy has been shown.
Mm-hmm.
There was no mercy before this, it seems, at least.
No, and Job was kind of a mediator for his family when he offered the sacrifices for his kids. So like they would have the festivals or the parties, and then he would bring them in and consecrate them. And
I think that was probably normal, like because progeny was so important, right, to be remembered in these ancient cultures. Like in order for you to have any significance in the world, you needed kids to remember you.
Mm-hmm.
So they could say, great.
Yeah. So Job was doing this on this like small scale.
Yeah.
And because of what happened, Job is doing it on this larger scale now for his friends and the people. And there was this one, I forget who said it, some saint from the 600s or 6th century said that God beat Job with a rod in order to spread his fragrance more widely in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, this is like,
sure, it's taken people a long time to get a snippet of that.
Right.
I just had to say that. Poor Job.
Well, it's interesting because the whole world changes, but Job is the one that has to suffer for it.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like everything changes, but Job's the one that's got to suffer.
Well, hello. Isn't that the story of Christ?
Right. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay, so all right, so the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. So he gets double of everything. So there's kind of this, I don't know what to think of it, but the first part is like Job's fortunes are restored. So everyone comes back to him. They have sympathy for him. They comfort him. They give him gold. Then the Lord blessed him. And then sort of that's like the multiplication of the animals and everything that's underneath him. So like he was given this money, and it's like he did what he did before. And not only that, he was even more successful and doubly successful. And so the blessing is kind of like this doubling. And then, but he still has 7 sons and 3 daughters. So he doesn't get double kids. So there's.
But isn't that number 10 the like perfection, kind of completeness? Didn't you say that?
Like, well, all the numbers that were kind of at the beginning are signify some sort of completeness. So,
okay.
So, but it is also like just having double the amount of children is not double the value. Like children have more than, like, you can't count their value. You can't just be like, you can do that with sheep. You'd be like 7,000 sheep, double the value. Yeah. So there's a sense in which having 7 sons and 3 daughters again is being like, you can't just double your kids and that's it's okay.
Yeah. They're not. Yeah. Are you happy now? You got two of each. Because they're unique, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then we get into the names of the daughters, and the daughters' names have significance. So the first daughter's name is Jemima, which means 3 daughters. Jemima means, I believe it means sun, or like dawn. So like a new day.
Jemima?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could be remembering this wrong. I'm doing this from memory. So new day, sun. Keziah is kind of like a cinnamon type spice that has a really good fragrance to it. It's something that that you would put in it. It's supposed to be fragrant, good. It's like perfume, but it's something you put in food. I also read somewhere that possibly it was to calm upset stomachs. So Job, from his sickness, like that would be something that he could eat that would maybe actually like soothe his sickness, soothe his stomach, which is interesting. So you have this idea of the new day, this soothing aroma,
medicinal herb.
Medicinal. And then Karen Hapuk, which means horn of antimony, technically. And horn is just like a case. But antimony is eyeshadow, eye makeup. But I can't remember the source of this, and it's probably not, I don't know how reliable, but I think it fits, where the eye makeup was actually made through a process of like making ashes. So it's something like beauty from ashes. And women would use it to put it on their eyes. And I read in another place that someone had heard about a type of eyeshadow makeup from the region that's actually made from seaweed, but it wasn't just like normal seaweed. It was like seaweed that grew way out deep.
Yeah.
So the only time you would get it would be after a big storm has rolled through, say like a whirlwind, and then that stuff would wash up on shore, and then you'd gather it and you dry it out, and then you'd process it or make the ashes from it, however they did that. And then you'd actually have beauty from ashes that come from the deep. So that would be, and the deep is representative of where Leviathan lives. It's also the place that Job went to in his sufferings. So I think there's some really powerful symbolism there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so then nowhere in the land, in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among with their brothers. I think
women's rights here. Hello.
Women's rights. I mean, like, you don't normally, first of all, you don't normally name the daughters. You don't normally name the women. And to have the women be so important, and then to name them, to bring them up at the end here, and have their names be like the meaning for that is representative of the type of transformation that's happened.
Yeah.
And then to get an inheritance along with their brothers. I mean, it's this itself is a sign or another aspect of the transformation.
Totally radical if you think about it as an ancient story. Like, this is really a fairy story for a lot of people back in the day.
Well, yeah, my mom was telling me, I don't know if this is true. My mom was telling me that so like the land of Israel split between Judah and Ephraim and Israel, and they're the tribe, and then eventually it was just Judah. But Judah, in, I think it's, I don't know, wherever they're mentioning the kings and stuff, they always mention the mother of the kings in the lines of the kings of Judah, and they don't for the kings of Israel. So the women were always the mothers were always important in the line of Judah. But double check that, because I didn't double check that.
I'll double check it.
Okay, so Job lived 140 years and saw. So Job has a second life. Job has been born again. Mm-hmm. Job lives another life. He has sons and his sons' sons for 4 generations. Mm-hmm. So he gets to see that it's not just his children make it, or his children's children, or his children's children's children. He gets to see all the way down to 4 generations. So he can be at peace when he goes. And then it says, then Job died, an old man full of days.
I don't think they needed to say being old. It's a given.
He died a young man. Yeah. And this idea of just being full of days, just like everything's been completed in him.
You know, my mother-in-law's 91, and we usually FaceTime with her once a week. And the last time we talked, she said, oh, you know, like, she's really alive. Like, she's super alive. She lives in her own house. She bicycles to the grocery store every day. She goes, I can't do the curbs anymore. She used to just bomb up the curb. Right? She can't do that, and she has to get off for the curbs.
She's got to walk her bike up the curb.
Oh, hello. And we're said, are you wearing a helmet? She goes, no. She never wore one, and she rebels against helmets. Says she won't wear them. But and you know, she gardens still. She has friends and family, and she has a good life, and she's very healthy. You know, she's really happy. But she's a widow. Her husband died like 4 years ago, and but she's like, oh, I've lived. I'm good.
Yep.
I'm good. You know. She goes, I don't know. It could be tomorrow. Could be any time. You know. But and she's not morbid about it, but there's a real sense that she just feels like she's full of days. Like she did everything already. Like she's done what a human being is meant to do. You know?
Yeah, I was just about to tell a similar story of someone. I forget where I heard it, but they're just like, I'm you know, the question is, what if we could extend our lives to live 400, 500, you know, live forever? Like, isn't there ever a point where you're done? I mean, you're finished. Like, not in a morbid way, but just like, you've done everything, and you're just like, okay, yeah, I did this. So
there's a few, you know, films and books that deal with that whole topic. You know, I don't know, because I haven't read them, if it's Brave New World, that, because Michael Martin mentioned it recently, where this one guy, he chooses to die, and nobody dies in this whatever society, eh? And he's like, it's the only thing he could choose of his own accord. And nobody gets it. They're just like, what? Why would you want to die? Like, you know. Then I thought about it, and I thought, well, if you lived for 500 years, would that make you like a perpetual teenager? Like, would you just be constantly looking back in your life and going, oh, cringe?
I bet after you reach 100, you just don't care.
Oh, I remember that. I have that hairdo. Oh, crap.
Back in the 70s, the 2070s? No, 1970s.
Oh, yeah. It's a very strange concept. And Bicentennial Man. Do you remember that movie with Robin Williams?
I never saw it.
Oh, you need to see it. He's some kind of an android or whatever in a futuristic world, and he starts, showing empathy, and he's sentient, and so then he falls in love with a woman, and they marry, and she's human, and she's aging, and he doesn't age, right? And he keeps trying to replace all her body parts, because he eventually, he gets into making, like, biotech, and so people can live forever, right? Longevity stuff. And she just finally says, no, just let me go. Just let me go. And he can't, he doesn't want to let her go. And he has no concept of mortality, because he's not human.
Yeah.
Right? It's such a good movie. You should watch it. Bicentennial Man.
It's like the elf and the king in Lord of the Rings. She gives up her immortality as an elf in order to be in love with him.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. You mean
I can't remember their names.
Aragorn?
I'm not that big of a Lord of the Rings nerd.
Me either.
But I've seen the movie.
Isn't that Aragorn falling in love with the elf?
Yeah, I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
And if I tried, I would just make something up.
He's human and she's an elf. Yeah. Yep.
All right. Well, that's probably a good place to stop.
You think? I think we should stop at Job, not Aragorn.
Oh, what do you want to say about Job?
Well,
let's finish this up.
A final thought, Jess. How does it feel finishing this last chapter?
Feels good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You think we did good?
I think so. Did you think we did good?
I think we did good. For the amateurs that we are.
Yeah, I thought we covered everything as well as we could.
If anybody thinks that there's something more that we should have talked about or missed, please leave us a comment.
Leave a comment. But I bet we could go through the whole thing again and get just as much out of it the second time. Like, I feel like the book is endlessly deep.
Oh yeah, it is. I know that just having, done this with you has opened up a whole bunch of stuff for me. Just going through the book of Job with you.
Yeah, me too.
It's just opened up, like, in a flowering kind of way, not in a like scraping open an old wound kind of way.
Thanks for making the distinction. It's like a flower opening. It's not like tearing off a scab.
That's right. No, really, it's just a lot of things have really come to life after having done this, so it's good.
Yeah, for me too. Before I did this with you, I went through it once with like a men's Bible study, but it was a lot shorter. Like we didn't get to read through everything together. So this was really good to be able to just like literally read everything in the book of Job and then talk about it as much as we could.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's lots more Job literature out there, so
yeah, we still have plenty to talk about.
Hint. I'm not really looking forward to leaving this behind.
It's a little sad. I don't know. I never like, I'll feel it in a few days.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be like, oh, we don't have another Job episode to record.
Yeah.
At least about this.
Another chapter of the book.
I know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Shari. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. I'm glad I got involved with this. This was really great.
Thanks.
Really great.